Wow, thank you. But there are some seats in the middle here. I know a lot of people standing in the back. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you. As Carl says, I have visited this institution several times and managed to escape without having to give a talk. But it couldn't go on, I think. I am going to focus almost wholly on reporting rather than conduct, because there's a lot to say there, and we can maybe later talk about conduct. I certainly don't, well, I will touch on the issue of poor conduct of trials. I'm going to focus entirely on clinical trials and indeed on randomized trials. And there will be some places where it's obvious that quality is also an issue, but the focus is on reporting. Okay, and the message is here, that the transparent reporting of clinical trials is essential, and I will attempt to justify that, although I hope actually it's not too difficult to persuade you that that's a reasonable perspective. So I start by, it shouldn't be necessary to explain what a research article is and why it's important, but that's where I start. A published research article is a permanent record, an archive if you like, which gives information to people now, but also for many years in the future. And it will be used by different people for different purposes. Some people, non-researchers probably, would be satisfied with maybe a superficial look at an article. Indeed, we know many only read the abstract. But other people will want to study a research article in great detail for perhaps for inclusion in a systematic review or as part of developing the evidence base to underpin clinical practice guideline. And clearly, I hope, if that study is not reported adequately, it can't be properly assessed. So only adequately reported studies can be fully appraised and used appropriately by these different people. And as I said, you have to remember that the primary impact of an article is one thing, but certainly for clinical trials, they feed into systematic reviews which underpin treatments maybe for the next 20 years. So it's, I think, often forgotten. It's obvious when you mention it, but it's not often realised that why it's so important. And in 10 and 20 years' time, we can't go back to the authors and ask them exactly what they did. So these articles should be fit for multiple purposes, and we're very fortunate because in the last, 10 years or so, we've seen a complete revolution in publication with electronic publications. You can almost always put additional material in a web appendix, and it's simply no longer an excuse, if it ever was, that there isn't enough space. It's just not true anymore. So, just to emphasize graphically what I just said, the research article is the end product of a particular process which we call primary research, where you design a study, you conduct it, you obviously write it up and you publish it, but that is the raw material for other processes. For the publication feeds into informing further research, systematic reviews, clinical guidelines, policies, and so on. Here's a nice quote. This is from the Surgical Journal. Poorly conducted trials are a waste of time, effort, and money. The most dangerous risk is associated with poor quality of reporting is an overestimate of the advantages of a given treatment, and we'll see that later. Whatever the outcome of a study, it is really hard for the average reader to interpret and verify the reliability of a poorly reported RCT, randomized controlled trial. In turn, this problem could result in changes in clinical practice that are based on false evidence and may harm patients. So this, not written by methodologists like myself, but by surgeons, makes a very clear link between not just the quality of the science, but the quality of the reporting of research and patient well-being. and actually says if you don't report your research properly, and I think we could agree that that there are not just scientific but also ethical issues involved there, that this could lead to the harming patients. And we'll see what you think. I have a lot of examples of evidence later which is very consistent with the fact that current practices are harmful. So scientific manuscripts, journal articles should present sufficient data for the reader to fully evaluate the information, reach their own conclusions about it, to assess if it's relevant to them, to assess whether the findings are reliable, and to make some judgment about how to make use of that information. And I'm sort of emphasising this, but I think it's just so critically important. You, as a reader, need to understand exactly what was done, whether you're a clinician, a researcher, a systematic reviewer, policymaker, or indeed all four of those things, or indeed other people. And research really, therefore, only has value, and this is, Carl mentioned this series in The Lancet, I will come to that in a moment. Research only has value if the study methods are valid, but also if the findings are published in a usable form. So the goal here should be transparency. And these 3 points at the bottom are 3 of my sort of high-level principles for research publication. Firstly, you should not mislead the reader. Secondly, more technically, the study should be given, the method should be given in enough detail to allow somebody else in principle to repeat that study. Now, I realise that's often not 100% achievable, but I think it should be a goal, that one should aim to do that. And lastly, that the study should be possible to include it in a systematic review, which means that the methods need to be fully described and the results need to be presented in a way that they can be included in a meta-analysis if that is desired. And anticipating what I'm going to say, at the moment, none of those 3 things applies across the whole medical literature. There are high percentages of failure to meet all these 3 attributes. There is, in fact, a literature which I'm not going to talk about failure to replicate. It's been particularly a concern more in laboratory sciences lately, and as I'm focusing on trials, I'm not going there. But failure to replicate is a huge, huge problem. So in 2009, this paper was published in The Lancet by Ian Chalmers and Paul Glaziou, Avoidable Waste in the Production and Reporting of Research Evidence. And notice the word reporting there, very, very important. Just last week, there was a meeting at the Lancet symposium building on this paper. And over the last 2 years, a large number of people have been involved in writing a series of 5 articles. They were published last week. They're all on the web. I think they're open access articles. The first one, so they all say research, increasing value, reducing waste. How to increase value and reduce waste. Firstly, when research priorities are set. Secondly, in research design, conduct and analysis. Thirdly, in research regulation and management. Fourthly, addressing inaccessible research. And lastly, waste from incomplete or unusable reports of biomedical research. And what I will say later addresses particularly the last one, which I'm actually the co-author of, and also the one before. So this is a pretty high-profile effort to try to make people aware of what they should have been aware of already, that the situation isn't adequate. And these papers make a lot of recommendations, and I'll come to some of those at the end. So I'm going to, the bulk of my talk, I will be running through a series of items on this taxonomy which you cannot read at the moment because I haven't put it up there. So I shall go through, I think there are five different types of poor reporting. So I'll start with, in a sense, the ultimate poor reporting is not reporting at all. So failure to publish your study, failure to publish a report of a study that's been completed. And this may be the case even when the paper has been presented at a conference. So not totally not reported, but not properly reported. Well, this is quite common, and you'll hear my phrase, this is quite common, quite a lot. So this is a review of 900 trials in stroke over a 50-year period. 20% of these trials were not properly published. That means what I just said, not published as journal articles. And these authors observed that some of these were actually quite large, and large enough to have influenced clinical practice and the findings of systematic reviews. And you might think that's it's a shame, that's pretty bad. Actually, that's pretty good. Most reviews have shown much higher percentages of non-publication of trials than 20%. So this review, published 2009 by Ross and colleagues, is a review of 635 trials. I'm just wondering if there's a pointer. Sorry, I meant to ask earlier, but it doesn't matter if there isn't. But anyway, 635 trials. Only. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what you can see is that 50% here is what one would, if these bars reach 50%, half the trials would be published. And in fact, only 46%. So these are trials that are registered on clinicaltrials.gov, big database. And they look to see, in that database, the trials say when they should be completed. So they waited 30 months after the trial completion, and only just under half of these trials had actually been completed and published 30 months after the trial should have completed. Now, of course, we don't know exactly when it completed. But this figure of around 50% is a more typical one for unpublished studies. And it's clearly large enough for us to be really concerned about bias associated with non-publication. What you can also see on this slide is that, perhaps with one exception, all the percentages are very similar. They're all running around 40 to 48%, whether it's international or wherever the study was done. There are obviously these people concerned about the US because they're American. The sample size doesn't seem to matter much. Which phase of trial did matter? Early phase trials are even worse. And there's some suggestion that, early phase were worse. Yeah, there's some suggestion that industry trials are published a bit less often than non-industry trials. It's not a huge difference. But it's about half. That's really unacceptable. And this, from a different study, in fact, this graph is taken from one of the Lancet papers, but it's data from a different study. And this is about trials of reboxetine, a drug for depression. And you can see here, we're looking at response as an outcome. One trial was reported with an odds ratio of 2.5 over here, but 6 trials were conducted and not reported with a combined odds ratio of 1.1. And you may wonder why those were not published by the drug company. The total, I couldn't possibly comment, as they say. The total is 7, and the effect is very small, if at all. And you can see a similar problem of adverse effects. Now you see the 2 trials that were published showed no adverse effects. The 6 unpublished trials all showed quite important adverse effects. Very interesting. It's not unique, and if you look at this paper, and I hope you will, you'll find a lot of other examples. So the consequences of failure to publish studies are that we have a reduced evidence base. We don't have as much evidence as we should have. And you saw there 1 trial published, 6 not published. It's very hard to think of any justification for that situation. But on top of that, there's this huge concern that what you get is not a random sample, but a very skewed sample. And again, you saw that very clearly in that one example, that there's a distortion. The evidence is both too little and in some sense in the wrong place on that graph, because the choice to publish is driven by the results. But as I said, even if there's no such bias, the evidence base is diminished, and therefore we have more uncertainty. So failure to publish, even for non-malign reasons is still a bad thing, because it leads to more uncertainty. So that's what we just talked about, non-publication. I'll now move on to selective reporting. So this means that even though the study was published, there was selection about which results were included in that publication, and that selection itself was done in a harmful way. So here's some examples of selective reporting in randomized trials. For a particular outcome, you could present the analysis both as an unadjusted or an adjusted analysis. You could do an intention to treat or a per protocol analysis, depending on who you want to include. You could treat missing outcomes in different ways. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of it, but there are many ways of treating missing outcomes. You could look at subgroup analyses. I'll come back to that point. And then for the total set of outcomes, and the average number of outcomes in a clinical trial is huge. If you look at protocols, the median number of outcomes is about 30. That's way more than the number that get published. And so there's a lot of scope for selecting from within the set. And there have been studies of this, and there have been several studies looking that have shown clear evidence of selective reporting of outcomes. And they have shown that non-significant findings are less likely to be published. That is, outcomes with non-significant findings. Well, that's consistent, of course, with what we've seen for whole studies. And there's some figures here. Unfortunately, these are odds ratios which are hard to interpret, but basically 4 separate cohorts have shown that statistically significant outcomes are more likely to be completely reported than non-significant outcomes. And these are highly significant biases. And here's an example from a trial from one of our studies. It was a trial in neurology, a surgical intervention. On the left is what the trial protocol said. The primary outcome was where the percentage of patients who had a score of some sort less than 3 at 1 year, and we know that that was not statistically significant. The publication, on the other hand, says the primary outcome was something completely different, which was statistically significant. And this is not happening by chance. This is deliberate manipulation. Another thing we know is that if people get significant results, they tend to publish them more quickly than if they get non-significant results, even if they do publish those. And that obviously is another way in which the public can be, and people can be harmed. At any point when you're doing a systematic review, the results you have available are biased towards the significant ones because they've been published quicker. And it's very hard to take that into account. I mean, of course, there are all the other biases as well, which pull in the same direction. So I'll come on to the third topic, which is a bit, well, they're all a bit related. This is incomplete reporting. Key information is missing. This is the one that people might be most familiar with in a way, that simply you can't find what you want. And this could be, well, it could be the methods or the results. So there are literally hundreds of published reviews of published randomized trials. I see a new one about once a week. So roughly 50 reviews a year being published. We're taking a sample of clinical trial reports and assessing the completeness of reporting, of the methods and of the results. And they all show a fairly sad picture. And we often cannot tell exactly how that research was done. And I want to emphasize that these are generic problems. Although I'm talking about randomized trials, broadly speaking, the same problems affect the whole medical literature, not just randomized trials, certainly not just studies of medicines, and certainly not just studies conducted by the pharmaceutical industry, even though we know there are some problems there. Here's an example of a review of non-pharmacological interventions in randomized trials published last year. 137 interventions, only 39% of these were adequately described. This is the actual intervention that's the subject of the trial. If you can't tell exactly what the intervention was, you can't apply it to your patients. You can't even understand exactly what the study was. They managed to increase this to 59% by getting interactions with the authors, but that's still pretty poor. So there's a major problem here. we're talking about usability of research. How that research is not properly usable if you don't understand what they're actually studying. How can it be? Let me emphasize a point in case I make it later. All these studies are studies of peer-reviewed papers. Just think about that. Here's another one. This is 59 trials of anti-arrhythmic agents. The numbers on the left refer to the consult statement, which I shall talk about later. So 69%, very nice of them to tell us actually where they did the study and what the setting was. 69% told us that. 86% completely specified their outcomes. That's good, actually. Randomization details, terrible. So this is those of you who know about randomized trials will know that the one thing that gives them their strength compared to other research is that they're randomized. So it's not unreasonable to want to know how they did that step. But it's normal to see that fewer than half the articles give that information. And there are three aspects here. It doesn't matter about the detail, but they're all running 25%, 19%, 14%. Whatever you may think of the relative importance, that is hopeless. Statistical methods properly described in half, and the results actually given as in a desirable format is also about half. That's really dismal, very depressing. This is 175 trials, adverse event reporting. Nearly all of these trials reported only adverse events that occurred either with a certain frequency or a certain severity. And that leaves open the possibility of selective reporting. A lot of them didn't specify the criteria used, and most of them grouped different adverse effects together, so you couldn't actually assess the frequency of particular adverse effects. So, whatever you look at, as I say, there's one published every week, they have different focus, but the message is usually the same. It's not nearly good enough. So, I'll come back to my taxonomy and I'll move on to misleading presentation. Claiming a study, this is an example, just so you understand, which I'm not going to discuss. There are a lot of studies out there which people claim are randomized trials, and actually they aren't. What I am going to talk about is what I call a post-hoc change of focus. That's a very polite way of putting it. We tend to use the word spin. I don't know if you use the word spin, but that's what I mean. So I was one of the group who published this paper a few years ago. We looked at a cohort of 80-something randomized trials where all the primary outcomes were not statistically significant. And then we looked to see how these were presented. So these are all published, and the primary outcomes are clearly not statistically significant. And we define spin this way. Specific reporting strategies, whatever their motive, to highlight that the experimental treatment is beneficial despite a statistically non-significant difference for the primary outcome, or to distract the reader from statistically non-significant results. And the major ways people do this are either to focus on a different outcome, not the primary outcome, or to focus on a subgroup, or to change the population being analysed in some way. There's a whole lot of things. Now, this is a huge report, and I'm going to show you one slide, but we reckoned that there was evidence of spin in all these different aspects, but 38% in the results section of the abstract, 58% in the conclusions of the abstract, and so on through the main text. And over 40% had spin in at least two different sections of the main text. You can query this, but all the details are on the web of all the assessments. 54-page appendix. Good luck. And here's another one. So it's not just us. This is a review of breast cancer trials. Breast cancer trials, this is important stuff. Spin was used frequently to influence positively the interpretation of negative trials by emphasizing the apparent benefit of a secondary endpoint. We found bias in reporting efficacy and toxicity in 33% and 67% of trials respectively, and so on. 59% of the trials, they were trying to suggest that the treatment was effective when they had not demonstrated that. Now, I'm not saying that the treatment is not effective just because it's not statistically significant, but to disregard the analysis which you've pre-specified as your focus of your work and say, well, yeah, I know, of course it works. It's not good. So wherever you look, you find this sort of thing. So I'll come back to my taxonomy, and the last one, inconsistencies between sources. There are multiple sources of information these days, most obviously the protocol, the trials registry entry, and the journal article. It's also possible to have inconsistencies within an article between the abstract and the main text, but I won't talk about that. So this is very common. There have been quite a few comparisons of protocols and publications, and several have found clear evidence of selective reporting of outcomes, which I've already mentioned. But discrepancies are common also between the primary outcome in the protocol and the primary outcome in the publication. Now, I already showed you one of those because there's a bit of overlap with these categories. This is a different paper. This is from primarily a Swiss group looking at trials submitted to ethics committee. 227 drug trials. And there were 333 articles relating to these 227 trials over an 18-year period, as you can see. 29% of the outcomes were reported discrepantly. Okay, so that's a lot of outcomes, nearly 3,000. What that means is not that we're not talking about the result, we're talking about the actual definition of the outcome. It's not the same outcome. So, to give an example, they may move the time point at which they assess the outcome. And that, to us, is a discrepancy. I hope to you it's a discrepancy as well. So what we find is that 7% of the primary outcomes in the protocols weren't reported at all. The primary outcome is what it's all about. But there we are, 7% weren't reported at all. 10% of the reported primary outcomes weren't defined in the protocol. Sorry, not primary. 10% of the outcomes were not mentioned in the protocol. And if we go to, no, maybe that is primary. Yeah. And then if we go to secondary outcomes, the figures are worse, 19% and 14%. And they show that discrepancies were more likely, this is a big surprise, if the result was statistically significant. It was also more likely for efficacy outcomes than for harms outcomes, and it was more likely for composite outcomes rather than simple or single outcomes. So that's not very good. Here's another one. This is in the field of analgesic trials. This is really good. 87 trials. There was not one case where they matched exactly. 21% didn't give adequate information in either one or both places, and the other 79% all showed discrepancies. So that's pretty good. They did not see a difference between industry and non-industry. And taking out poor reporting, 30% showed blatant discrepancies. And the same sort of thing as before. And for this, there was a big difference between industry and non-industry, as you can see at the bottom. But there's no consistent picture in that regard. The consistency is that the reporting is terrible, that the discrepancies are extremely frequent and totally unacceptable, of course. It's fine, of course, to write an article and explain, well, we changed our primary outcome because and such, and give some reason. But of course, this is not what happens. So that's my taxonomy for you, and as I have said, all these practices are very common, and the combined effect of that is of course unknown, but it's hard to imagine that the combined effect of that is minor. It's very hard to quantify these things. The consequences, I hope it's clear to you that you're going to be misled if you take the literature at face value. Ultimately, the literature is biased towards significant results, and I've shown you there are several mechanisms whereby that bias comes in, and they all basically pull in the same direction. It's particularly clear for randomized trials, excluding the small proportion where people set out to show trials are similar, interventions are similar. Basically, people are looking for differences, they're looking for statistical significance, and that is driving this process. So the reliability of articles, the reliability of the literature as a whole is obviously suspect. The reliability of specific articles is impeded by poor reporting. Poor reporting of the interventions, poor reporting of the statistical methods, poor reporting of the results. And I've only given you just a little bit of a flavour of that there is a vast literature. There are, I believe, serious consequences, therefore, for all these groups and indeed for patients as a result of this. And this is surely exactly the opposite of why people do medical research. The whole point of doing medical research is to benefit patients. Is it? Or is it to benefit careers? I don't know, one or the other. So if we look at systematic reviews, which take the published literature and try to make sense of it, here are some examples. Here are some quotes from published systematic reviews about poor reporting. Just briefly, risk of bias assessment was hampered by poor reporting of trial methods. Poor reporting of interventions impeded replication. 15 trials met the inclusion criteria. Only 4 could be included as data were impossible to use in the other 11. Poor reporting of duration of follow-up. Poor reporting of data meant that individual effect sizes could not be calculated for any of these studies. Hopeless. And, these are across different topics. And you can find these. Just go into Google Scholar and type in poor reporting and systematic review. That's how I found these. It's very easy. And there's loads of them. So let me go back. This is 1950. A basic principle can be set up that it is at least as important to describe the techniques employed and the conditions in which the experiment was conducted as to give the detailed statistical analysis. And he talks about randomization. So this guy understood. This is 1950. It took a long time before much happened with regard to trying to help people to write their reports better. But we now have reporting guidelines. A reporting guideline is the minimum set of items required to be reported to give a clear and transparent account of what was done and what was found in a particular study. There's a focus in particular on aspects that might introduce bias into the research, but also on presenting the fundamental information you need, like what was the intervention, what was the sample size, things like that. And the benefits of using these guidelines is you should get more complete, more accurate reports, and certainly more transparency, making it easier for systematic reviewers and other people to assess the quality and basically putting right all the problems I've just said before. It also makes it a lot easier to search for the studies you want. And the consort statement was not the first, but it was the first widely known guideline. It was a guideline for reporting randomized trials. It was first published in 1996. Its most recent third version was published in 2010. And it's a checklist, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, a checklist of 25 items that should be reported, where possible based on empirical evidence. There's also a flow diagram describing patient progress through the trial, and it's been very widely supported by journals. Hundreds, 600, 700 journals have supported it. You wouldn't guess that from what I've just shown you, by the way, but the principle is that authors should not be able to hide their study inadequacies by omitting important information. And this is where reporting and methodology come together. One of the main reasons for having good reports is so that you can understand how the study was done. But more than that, if it's not being done in a sound way, if it's been done badly, you want to know that. It's possible to disguise deficiencies by omitting information, and therefore the reader won't know that you did the wrong thing. And so the transparency is aimed not just at providing information, but actually helping you assess whether it's a reliable study or not. And there have been lots of extensions to CONSORT, which I won't go into just now. There are lots of other reporting guidelines that Carl will say something about in terms of diagnosis, for example, in a minute. And the problem is at the bottom that most of these guidelines are not widely supported by journals, and even those like CONSORT that are not widely adhered to by researchers, and so the potential impact is blunted, it's not being achieved. Also, we recently published a year ago the SPIRIT guidelines. This is moving more into conduct, the guidelines for writing clinical trial protocols. And there's a big overlap of content between this and what's in the CONSORT checklist. And protocols, again, is something that we'll come back to briefly. We set up the Equator Network. This is the homepage of our recently updated website, and that's one of our splendid buildings in Oxford, where you can find information about over 200 different reporting guidelines and a lot of other great stuff, and the web address is up at the top there. So this is all very well. So we have a bit of a mismatch. There's a big industry in writing reporting guidelines, and there's the rest of the world which is taking no notice of it at all, which is deeply depressing. So what is the impact? Is the quality of reporting improving? Well, we published a review of 50 studies looking at the impact of CONSORT endorsements. Now, this is not the impact of using CONSORT, it's the impact of journals endorsing CONSORT, which is a bit of an indirect measure. And we found that there was slow improvement. I won't give you any of the numbers, but there is signs of slow improvement of reporting, but still a hell of a long way to go. And clearly, endorsement is one thing, but actual adherence is way down still. This doesn't matter, you can't read this. This is a graph showing compliance to 30 items from the CONSORT statement. On the left, 0%, and on the right, 100%. Somewhere if I can do it. And you can see that, roughly speaking, on average, half the papers report these items. And the ones in the red box are the items about randomization, which I said to you are always less than 50%, and there they are. So this is quite typical. These are trials in transplantation. This is a recent paper looking at reports over time in high-impact general and specialized medical journals. The pink dot is the pink line. Can you see that? Yeah. The pink line is related to trial quality. The allocation concealment is a key part of the randomization. The most steep line, which is black, I think, relates to inclusion of flow diagrams, which are almost non-existent before the 1996 CONSORT statement. It represents the biggest change, actually, is the inclusion of flow diagrams in journal articles, which is great. However, we did a review of flow diagrams, and we found that, well, you can see, I won't read it all out, but there are a lot of key bits of information that are not included in a high proportion of these flow diagrams. So definitely step in the right direction, but must try harder. Again, remember, these are all peer-reviewed publications. So are the problems worse for commercial trials? Well, there are some extremely well-publicized examples, and the Lancet series gives a lot of detail of some of those. And there have been reviews of the literature, but it's not a consistent picture. There are problems, clear problems, for both commercial and non-commercial research. And this is just one review. This is a Cochrane review, showed that industry-sponsored studies more often had favourable efficacy results, more often favourable harms results, in other words, less harm, and more often favourable conclusions. And I don't suppose we'll find that terribly surprising. But these are not massive effects. And the broad problems apply to non-commercial trials too. But as I say, their analysis does suggest some sort of industry bias, which isn't based on the actual methodologies of the trials. Indeed, I think there is evidence that industry trials are methodologically of a higher standard than non-industry trials. So, here we are. Not all trials are published. Research reports are seriously inadequate a lot of the time. Improvement over time is very slow. We have reporting guidelines, but they're not being adhered to. We actually also have a lot of statements on what is responsible research conduct, because I would certainly argue that not reporting your research properly is not responsible. And it's much easier to keep on writing papers saying how bad things are than actually to make it better. It's always hard to change behaviour. So how can we speed up things? Very difficult. There are no easy answers, of course. Behaviour change is always tough. All parties need to participate in efforts to make things better for everyone, for society, for patients, for everyone. Authors, peer reviewers, editors, funders, universities, ethics committees, everyone has a role in principle. It's trying to work out what that is. I think there has been a wide failure of major bodies to recognise these problems and do something about it. And I hope these Lancet articles will help in that regard. The PLOS Medicine editor said a few years ago that it is indeed the responsibility of everyone to ensure that published record is an unbiased and accurate representation of research. And that's, I'm sure, what the public expect, and it's not what we have just now. So, what can be done? So, how can we move or shift this reporting culture? Well, I think we need collaboration amongst parties. It's easy. This is still not very specific, I appreciate that. All the groups listed at the top. We're working towards this goal that accurate and complete and transparent reporting of research should be considered the norm. That is what should be normal. And as I've shown you before, it's extremely unusual just now. We need better policies, requirements, expectations, better tools, help people. We need certainly education and training, motivation and incentives. At the moment, there are no incentives really that matter. If you can get a bad paper published, why should you spend a lot more time working on it to make it a bit better? And so on. So in this series of 5 papers, which, as Carl said, just came out and which are very conveniently timed for this session, all the papers include a lot of recommendations, and I'm just going to show you the key recommendations for this paper on reporting. There are 3 main recommendations, and what's nice is they explicitly put the finger on who should do what, not just what should happen. So it's not passive, it's active. Funders, research institutions should shift research regulations and rewards to align with better and more complete reporting. And these recommendations have to be seen in the light of all the other recommendations in the other 4 papers, which I'm not showing you, of course. Research funders should take responsibility for a reporting infrastructure that supports good, and I would say requires good reporting and archiving. Funders, institutions and publishers should improve the capability and capacity of authors and reviewers in high quality and complete reporting. Okay, there's lots of high language here. We need to train people to think and act properly. It's not acceptable, in my view, for us to continue the way we've been going. And it's been getting worse as pressures mount on researchers to publish in high-impact factor journals and so on and so forth. Interesting paradox that 50% of trials are not being published at a time when there's so much pressure to publish. You might like to think about that. So what else? These are things I'm not going to talk about. Protocols. There's a lot of interest in making protocols available. I co-edit a journal called Trials, which publishes clinical trial protocols. It's been a big change in the years since we set up the journal, and the numbers of protocols that have been published now is increasing. It's quite high. We have guidance on writing and writing protocols, and as I said, they're now being published. There's trial registration, which does not prevent a lot of problems, but it helps identify where there are problems. It's easier to discover that a trial is not being published than it used to be, but that doesn't tell you what the results were. And there's a lot of interest in data sharing, which I won't talk about, but it's obviously a really important issue. So my final comments are here. I think the findings of all randomized trials should be published. I think the reports of those trials should be complete and transparent. I know that currently that doesn't happen, that many trial reports omit crucial information, which greatly weakens their value and indeed makes them misleading. And it's clear that peer reviewers and editors are simply not doing what they should be doing to ensure that the reports of trials are usable. Adherence to consort would maximise the value of trial reports, and journals should institute systems to ensure adherence, which again they clearly are not doing. All parties, not just the ones I just mentioned, all the ones I mentioned before, need to work to remedy this unacceptable situation. So this is my final sentence. Good reporting is not an optional extra. It's an essential component to doing good research. Thank you.